What would you do if, on your wedding day, a mysterious letter whispered secrets about the man you just vowed to love forever? Emma thought she knew Khaled, but his hidden past holds a truth that could shatter everything. Betrayal, danger, and love collide. Are you ready to uncover the truth? The golden rays of the Napa Valley sunset blanketed the sprawling vineyard estate, casting a warm glow on rows of meticulously arranged chairs and tables adorned with ivory linens and blush roses. Guests mingled, their laughter blending with the soft hum of a live string quartet. This was Emma's dream wedding, a scene plucked from her most cherished fantasies. But deep in her chest, unease stirred like a faint, unwelcome whisper. Emma Whitaker stood alone in the bride's suite, her reflection staring back from the full-length mirror. Her lace gown fit her perfectly, its intricate patterns wrapping her like a delicate cocoon. Yet, the usual pre-wedding jitters seemed heavier today, as if carrying a weight she couldn't name. She took a deep breath, smoothing the fabric of her dress, trying to convince herself that everything was fine. A soft knock broke her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Maggie, her mother, or perhaps her bridesmaid. Instead, a gloved hand slipped an envelope under the door. Emma froze. She crossed the room hesitantly, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The envelope bore no name, no sign of who sent it, just her initials scrawled in shaky, uneven letters. With trembling fingers, she tore it open, revealing a single sheet of paper. The words were hurriedly written, but unmistakable. "Do you truly know the man you're marrying?" Her breath caught. She read the sentence again, disbelief knotting her stomach. Who would send this? And why today? The air seemed to thicken around her, every second stretching impossibly long. Emma glanced toward the window. Outside, laughter and clinking glasses painted a picture of celebration. But this letter shattered that illusion. Her hands clenched the paper tightly. This was someone's idea of a cruel joke. It had to be. "Emma?" a voice called from the hall. Maggie's familiar tone was comforting, grounding. "It's time, honey." Emma folded the letter swiftly, tucking it into the hidden pocket of her gown. "Coming," she answered, her voice steady despite the swirling unease. As she descended the stairs, the grandeur of the estate unfolded before her. A masterpiece of opulence Khaled had insisted on. Rows of guests rose to their feet, their eyes turning toward her with admiration. Khaled stood at the altar, his tailored suit as flawless as the smile he wore. For a fleeting moment, the tension ebbed. This was her future, the man she loved. Everything else could wait. Their vows were like poetry, rehearsed but heartfelt, echoing through the air as the sun dipped lower. Emma's gaze locked with Khaled's. His eyes, dark and unreadable, betrayed nothing but devotion. She willed herself to believe that. She needed to believe that. Yet as she spoke her part, a shadow flickered in his expression, a hesitation so brief it might have gone unnoticed. But not by her. Emma's heart sank, the whisper of doubt now a steady hum. As they shared their first dance under a canopy of twinkling lights, Khaled's hands on her waist felt both grounding and distant. His smile never faltered, but Emma couldn't shake the nagging sense that his mind was elsewhere. She searched his face for answers but found only the mask he wore so well. Midway through the song, Khaled's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, glancing at the screen with a sharp intake of breath. "I need to take this," he murmured, his tone apologetic but firm. Without waiting for her reply, he stepped away, disappearing into the shadows beyond the dance floor. Emma was left standing alone, the music and laughter around her growing faint, as if muffled by an invisible barrier. Her chest tightened. Something was wrong. She could feel it, like the storm that lingers just beyond the horizon, unseen but inevitable. From the corner of her eye she caught movement, a figure lingering near the edge of the vineyard, half hidden among the rows of vines. They wore a long coat, their face obscured by the dim light. Emma turned instinctively, her heart pounding. The figure vanished before she could process what she'd seen. She glanced toward the path where Khaled had disappeared, clutching the fabric of her gown. Her instincts screamed at her. Something was starting, and whatever it was, it would change everything. The night air hung heavy with the scent of roses and freshly turned earth, as Emma wandered back to the suite she and Khaled would share. The vibrant hum of celebration echoed faintly from the vineyard below, but she was alone now. Alone with the letter hidden in her pocket, its words searing her mind like a brand. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her fingers brushing the fabric where the letter lay tucked. She wanted to believe it was a prank, a cruel attempt to rattle her on what should have been the happiest day of her life. But something in Khaled's demeanor tonight, the hesitation in his vows, the shadows behind his smile, planted seeds of doubt she couldn't ignore. Emma pulled the letter from her pocket, unfolded it, and stared at the words again. "Do you truly know the man you're marrying?" Her breath shuddered. She had always known Khaled was a private man, that his past in the Middle East was one he rarely spoke of, but she had trusted him, trusted his silence. A sudden vibration on the table startled her. Khaled's phone. He must have left it behind when he took his call. She hesitated, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. The temptation gnawed at her, the need to know why he had disappeared during their first dance, but she shook her head and turned away. That wasn't who she was. Instead, she crossed to the small desk near the window and sat. Her fingers traced the delicate paper of the letter, smoothing its creases. From the desk drawer, she retrieved a notepad and pen, hoping writing her thoughts might ease the turmoil within her. But as she opened the drawer, her hand froze. An envelope lay inside, similar in size to the one she had received earlier. This one bore no initials, no marks to suggest its owner. Emma's heart raced as she carefully unfolded it. Her eyes scanned the words, and the blood drained from her face. The letter was addressed to Khaled. It was a warning. A name leapt out from the page, Sofia Alvarez. Emma's grip on the paper tightened as she read, "Your silence will not protect you. The truth always surfaces, Khaled. Tell her before I do." Emma slumped back into the chair, the letter trembling in her hand. Sofia Alvarez. The name was unfamiliar, yet it felt like a storm cloud rolling over her future. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her wedding day had become a theater of secrets, and she was standing center stage without a script. A knock at the door jolted her upright. She stuffed the letter back into the drawer, slamming it shut just as Khaled's voice called through the door. "Emma, are you in there?" She hesitated before answering, her voice steadier than she felt. "Yes, come in." The door opened, and Khaled stepped inside. His face, so effortlessly composed before their guests, now showed lines of strain. He looked at her, and for a fleeting moment guilt flashed in his eyes before he quickly masked it with a smile. "I'm sorry I left like that," he began, stepping closer. "Business, a pressing matter I couldn't ignore." Emma wanted to believe him, wanted to brush aside the gnawing feeling that this was more than a business call, but her trust was on shaky ground and her curiosity was relentless. "Khaled, is there something you're not telling me?" He stiffened, just slightly, but enough for her to notice. "What do you mean?" Her throat tightened, the words she wanted to ask tangling into a knot she couldn't untie. Instead, she gestured to his phone. "You've been getting calls all night. Is everything okay?" Khaled exhaled, relief softening his features. "It's nothing you need to worry about. I promise." The words felt like a wall going up between them, and Emma hated how much it hurt. She nodded, forcing a smile. "All right." But inside, her resolve hardened. She couldn't keep ignoring the cracks in their foundation, not anymore. Later that night, long after Khaled had fallen asleep, Emma crept back to the drawer. She pulled out the second letter, reading it again and again until the words blurred into the darkness. Sofia Alvarez. The name pulsed in her mind, a riddle she was determined to solve. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Khaled's phone glowing softly on the bedside table. She glanced at him, his breathing steady, his face peaceful in sleep. It felt like betrayal, but the weight of her doubts was heavier. She picked up the phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. A single text message awaited, its preview visible even before she unlocked it. Her heart pounded as she read, "Ask Khaled about the boy." The phone slipped from her fingers, landing silently on the bedspread. Emma's world tilted, the floor beneath her steady, but the life she thought she knew trembling like a fragile glass about to shatter. The morning sun filtered through the gauzy curtains of the estate's grand hall, casting soft golden streaks across the polished floors. Guests dressed in their finest gathered for the brunch celebration, their laughter and clinking glasses filling the air. Emma, though, sat stiffly at the long head table beside Khaled, her smile practiced but hollow. The name Sofia Alvarez lingered like a specter in her mind, eclipsing the joy she should have felt. Khaled seemed to sense her detachment, his hand brushing hers beneath the table. "You're quiet today," he murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Emma forced her lips into a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Just taking it all in," she replied, her tone light but distant. She didn't dare mention the letters, not yet. She needed more answers before confronting him again. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp creak of the main doors swinging open. Heads turned toward the disturbance as a woman strode confidently into the room. Emma's stomach dropped. She didn't need to be told who this was. Sofia Alvarez was striking, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her red dress a bold statement against the muted tones of the other guests. She moved with purpose, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, a jarring rhythm that silenced the crowd. "Excuse me," she announced, her voice cutting through the stunned murmurs. "I'm looking for Khaled al-Nasseri." Emma's chest tightened as every pair of eyes turned toward Khaled, who had gone rigid beside her. His hand slipped away from hers, his jaw tightening. "This is not the time or place," Khaled said, his tone calm but laced with warning. He rose slowly, his stature commanding, but even he couldn't mask the tension radiating from him. "Oh, I think it's exactly the time and place," Sofia countered, her gaze unwavering. She produced a folded document from her clutch, holding it up for everyone to see. "You think you can sweep your past under the rug, Khaled? Not anymore." Emma's pulse raced. The room was deathly silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. She glanced between Khaled and Sofia, her mind a whirlwind of questions. What was in that document? And why did Sofia look so sure of herself? Khaled stepped toward Sofia, his voice low but firm. "This is a private matter. Leave now." Sofia laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Private? You made it public the moment you decided to pretend this didn't exist." She turned, her gaze locking onto Emma. "I suppose your lovely new wife has no idea, does she?" Emma felt the weight of every gaze in the room. Her face burned with humiliation, but she forced herself to remain composed. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Sofia smirked, her eyes gleaming with something dark and triumphant. "Oh, sweetheart, you really think you're the first? Khaled has a way of leaving things behind when they become inconvenient." "Enough!" Khaled's voice was sharp, cutting through Sofia's words. He grabbed her arm, but she yanked it free, thrusting the document toward Emma. "See for yourself," Sofia said coldly, "before you find out the hard way." Emma hesitated, her heart pounding as she reached for the paper. The room seemed to close in around her, every breath heavy as she unfolded it. Her eyes scanned the lines, her stomach dropping with each word. It was a financial agreement. Payments from Khaled to Sofia spanning years. She looked up, her vision blurred with tears she refused to shed in front of these strangers. "What is this, Khaled?" Her voice cracked, a mix of anger and betrayal. "It's not what it looks like," Khaled said quickly, his hands raised defensively. "She's twisting the truth, Emma. Twisting the truth," Sofia repeated, her voice venomous. "Why don't you tell her about the boy, Khaled? Or should I?" Emma's world tilted. "The boy." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Khaled's expression faltered for the first time, his composure cracking. "Not here," he said through gritted teeth. "We'll talk later." Sofia crossed her arms, her smirk victorious. "Sure, talk later. That's what you always say, isn't it, Khaled?" The room erupted into murmurs as Sofia turned on her heel and strode out, her presence leaving a gaping hole in the celebration's fragile atmosphere. Emma barely registered the concerned glances of the guests as she clutched the document in her trembling hands. "Khaled," she said, her voice shaking. "Is there a boy?" Khaled's jaw clenched. "Let's go somewhere private," he said, his tone firm but pleading. Emma stared at him, her heart breaking under the weight of his silence. Without a word, she turned and walked out of the hall, leaving Khaled to follow. Or not. She didn't care anymore. The whispers of the guests followed her as she disappeared into the corridor, their voices blending into a chorus of doubt and speculation. But Emma didn't hear them. All she could hear was Sophia's voice echoing in her mind. Before you find out the hard way. The door to the private study slammed shut behind Khaled as he followed Emma inside. Her shoulders were rigid, her back to him, the damning document still clutched in her trembling hands. The silence was deafening, broken only by the muffled sounds of the brunch party continuing beyond the thick walls. Talk, Emma demanded, her voice sharp and strained, but her eyes didn't meet his. She stared at the wall, her breath shallow. No more excuses, no more evasions. Tell me everything, Khaled. Khaled hesitated, his hands curling into fists at his sides. It's not what you think, he began, his tone pleading. Sophia, she's trying to destroy us. Destroy us! Emma spun around, her eyes blazing with hurt and disbelief. What is this, Khaled? Payments? Years of them. What was she to you? She wasn't. Khaled paused, his jaw tightening. It was a mistake a long time ago. I didn't know she would. Stop, Emma cut him off, her voice trembling. I'm not asking for excuses. I'm asking for the truth. Did you have a child with her? Khaled's silence was more telling than any words he could have spoken. Emma's grip on the document faltered, her arms falling to her sides. Oh my God, she whispered, the weight of his silence crushing her. There is a boy, isn't there? Yes. The word was barely audible, but it was enough. Khaled stepped toward her, his hand reaching out. But it's not what you think. I didn't know. Didn't know? Emma's voice rose, her anger cutting through her heartbreak like a blade. You didn't know? You expect me to believe that after all of this? Khaled's eyes darkened, his own frustration breaking through. I didn't know, Emma. She never told me. Not until it was too late. Too late, Emma laughed bitterly, tears welling in her eyes. And what about now, Khaled? What else haven't you told me? How many more lies are waiting to crawl out of the shadows? There are no lies, Khaled shot back, his voice echoing in the room. He caught himself exhaling sharply, trying to regain control. I handled it the best way I could. I paid her to make sure the boy had what he needed. That's all. And what about me? Emma's voice cracked. When were you going to tell me? Or were you just hoping I'd never find out? I was trying to protect you, Khaled said, his tone softer now. To protect us. Protect us? Emma shook her head, disbelief etched across her face. You can't protect something built on secrets, Khaled. Khaled's shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair. I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want any of this to touch you. Well, it's touched me, Emma snapped, her voice trembling. It's consumed me. How am I supposed to trust you after this? How am I supposed to believe anything you say? Khaled looked at her, his expression pained, his defenses crumbling. Because I love you, he said simply, the words heavy with sincerity. I love you, Emma, and I swear to you I'm not hiding anything else. Emma's breath hitched, the raw emotion in his voice pulling at the edges of her anger. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. She turned away, her gaze falling to the document still in her hands. The lines blurred through her tears, but one detail stood out. A date. This payment, she said quietly, her voice steadier now. This was made just last month, after we were already engaged. Khaled's face fell. It was her last demand, he admitted. She threatened to go public if I didn't give her what she wanted. Emma turned back to him, her eyes searching his face. And you didn't think I deserved to know? You didn't think I could handle the truth? I was trying to protect you, Khaled repeated, his voice breaking. Everything I've done was to protect you. Emma stared at him for a long moment, her emotions a chaotic storm threatening to pull her under. You don't protect someone by lying to them, Khaled. You protect them by trusting them. Her words hung in the air like a verdict, final and unyielding. Khaled took a step toward her, his hand reaching out again, but this time Emma didn't move. She looked at him, her tears spilling over, her heartbreak etched across her face. I need time, she whispered, her voice raw. I can't do this right now. Khaled stopped, his hand falling to his side. Emma. But she was already turning toward the door, the document still clutched in her hand. As she walked away, Khaled was left standing alone in the silence, the weight of his choices pressing down like an unbearable burden. The park was quiet. the faint rustle of leaves carried on the breeze. Emma sat on a bench under a sprawling oak tree, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her heart raced as she scanned the open field ahead, watching for any sign of Sophia. She didn't know what she was hoping to gain by coming here, but the unanswered questions gnawed at her until she could no longer bear it. A voice broke through her thoughts. "You came." Emma looked up to see Sophia standing a few feet away, her son clutching her hand. He was small, no older than 8, with thick black hair and dark eyes that mirrored Khaled's. Emma's chest tightened. She forced a breath and stood. "I need the truth," Emma said, her voice trembling. She glanced at the boy, his wide eyes fixed on her. "No more games, no more accusations, just tell me everything." Sophia nodded, her expression unreadable. She guided the boy toward the bench, kneeling beside him as she looked up at Emma. "This is Tariq," she said softly. "Khaled's son." Emma's breath hitched. Hearing it said aloud made the reality hit harder. Her gaze fell to the boy, who shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "Tariq," Emma said, her voice faltering. "Do you understand why I'm here?" The boy hesitated before nodding. "You're his new wife," he said, his voice small but steady. "Mama said, you don't know about me." Emma's throat tightened. "No, I didn't," she admitted, her words catching on the lump in her throat. Sophia placed a hand on Tariq's shoulder, her eyes softening. "Why don't you go play for a bit, sweetheart? I need to talk to her alone." Tariq looked at his mother, then back at Emma. "Will you tell him I'm here?" he asked, his tone laced with quiet hope. Emma's heart broke at the weight of his words. I don't know," she said honestly. Tariq nodded as though he expected her answer, then turned and wandered toward the swings. His small figure seemed so fragile against the vastness of the park. Sophia straightened, her gaze hardening as she turned back to Emma. "He doesn't even ask for much," she said bitterly. "Just to know his father, but Khaled, he's too busy protecting his perfect little world to care." Emma clenched her fists, anger bubbling beneath her grief. "He said you blackmailed him, that you're using Tariq to ruin him." Sophia laughed bitterly. "Of course he did. Did he tell you about the first time he saw Tariq? How he looked at his own son and said he wasn't ready to be a father?" Emma blinked, her heart sinking. "You're saying he knew all along?" "No," Sophia admitted, her tone quieter now. "He didn't know at first. I didn't tell him when I found out I was pregnant. I thought I could raise Tariq on my own. But then things got hard and I reached out. I told Khaled everything and he said he'd help. But he didn't want to be involved. Not really." Emma felt as though the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. "So he gave you money instead of being a father?" Sophia nodded, her expression twisting with anger and pain. "That's all he's ever done. Payments to make the problem go away. That's who Khaled is, Emma. He buys his way out of everything." Emma shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "You don't understand him. You don't know what he's been through." "Don't I?" Sophia shot back. "I know what it's like to be discarded when you're no longer convenient. You think you're special, that he won't do the same to you." The words struck Emma like a physical blow. Her lips parted, but no words came. She looked away, her gaze falling on Tariq as he swung back and forth, his laughter faint but clear. "You don't have to believe me," Sophia continued, her tone softer now. "But that boy deserves more than this. He deserves to know his father." Emma turned back to Sophia, her resolve hardening. "I'll talk to Khaled, but this isn't just about you or him anymore. It's about Tariq, and I won't let him be another casualty in whatever this is." Sophia's expression softened, her lips trembling. "I just want him to be loved," she said, her voice breaking. "That's all I've ever wanted." Emma nodded, her heart aching for the woman before her, but even more for the boy who swung alone in the distance, waiting for a father who might never come. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the park, Emma stood. "I'll make sure Khaled knows," she said firmly, "but don't make me regret this." Sophia met her gaze, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Emma turned, her steps heavy as she walked toward her car. The weight of Tariq's words and the look in his eyes stayed with her, pressing down like a storm cloud she couldn't shake. The sound of the heavy door closing behind Emma echoed through the grand estate like a final punctuation mark. She dropped her bag onto the polished floor of the guest room she had chosen to retreat to. It felt so distant from the marital suite, both in proximity and meaning. Her fingers trembled as she paced, the tension coiling tighter with every step. Minutes ago, she had returned from the park, her mind still reeling from the weight of Tariq's words and Sophia's accusations. She felt like a stranger in a life she had believed was hers, surrounded by luxury and promises that now felt like empty illusions. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Emma, please." Khaled's voice came through, subdued but resolute. "We need to talk." Her pulse quickened, her emotions warring between anger and longing. "Come in," she finally said, her voice steady but cold. Khaled entered, his presence filling the room with a tension that mirrored her own. He closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment watching her. "I know what you're thinking," he began, his tone cautious. Emma crossed her arms, her eyes locking onto his. "Do you?" she asked sharply. "Because I don't think you understand how much damage you've done." Khaled exhaled, his hand running through his hair. "I never wanted to hurt you. You have to believe that." "Believe?" Emma scoffed, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to believe anything you say now? You didn't just lie to me, Khaled. You lied by omission, by silence, by letting me walk into this marriage blind." "I was protecting you," Khaled insisted, his voice steady but desperate. "Sophia, Tariq, they're complicated. I didn't want to burden you with a past that I thought I had handled." "Handled?" Emma's voice cracked, her emotions spilling over. "Is that what you call it? Paying her off? Ignoring your son? That's not handling anything, Khaled. That's running away." Khaled flinched, her words hitting him harder than he expected. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said quietly. "Keeping them out of my life, out of our life, so we could start fresh." Emma shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "There's no fresh start when you build it on lies." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Khaled finally stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "I can fix this. Tell me what I need to do, Emma. I'll do anything." She looked at him, her heart aching at the raw emotion in his voice. But the fractures in her trust ran deep, and she couldn't ignore them. "It's not that simple," she said softly. "You can't just fix this with promises. I need time, Khaled. Time to figure out if I can even trust you again." Khaled's face fell, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "Emma, please." She held up a hand, stopping him. "I'm going to stay in the guest room tonight," she said, her voice firm. "I need space to think." Khaled hesitated, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "If that's what you need," he said quietly, "I'll respect it." As he turned to leave, Emma's voice stopped him. "Khaled, does Tariq even know you? Have you ever even met him?" Khaled paused, his hand on the doorknob. He didn't turn around, but his voice was heavy with regret. "Once, when he was a baby, I told myself it was better that way. For him." Emma's breath caught, a fresh wave of anger and sadness washing over her. "You're wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "You weren't protecting him. You were protecting yourself." Khaled didn't respond. He opened the door and stepped out, closing it softly behind him. Emma stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where he had been. Her mind raced with memories of their time together, of every promise he had made, now shadowed by the reality of his past. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. The image of Tariq's small, hopeful face haunted her, his question echoing in her mind. "Will you tell him I'm here?" Emma didn't have an answer. Not for Tariq, not for Khaled, and not even for herself. Emma sat in the dimly lit corner of Noah's bookstore, the familiar scent of aged paper and leather-bound spines surrounding her like a cocoon. The warmth of the place, once a refuge, now felt stifling as her thoughts spiraled. She clutched a steaming cup of tea Noah had made, but the comfort it was meant to bring eluded her. Across from her, Noah leaned back in his chair, his expression pensive. "So he has a son," Noah said finally, breaking the silence. His tone was careful, measured, as though afraid to push too hard. "And he just, what? Paid her off to keep it quiet?" Emma nodded, her grip tightening on the cup. That's the story, she said, her voice hollow. He thought it would protect everyone. But what kind of father thinks money can replace being there? Noah frowned, drumming his fingers on the arm of his chair. It's a mess, he admitted. But Emma, you know Khaled isn't a bad man. Flawed, yes. But bad? I don't think so. Emma looked up, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. I don't know who he is anymore, Noah. Every time I think I understand him, another secret comes crawling out of the shadows. Noah studied her for a moment before nodding slowly. All right, let's assume Khaled was trying to do the right thing in the wrong way. But what about her? This Sophia, what's her game? Emma sighed, setting her cup down. I met her. She seems angry, bitter. But when she talks about Tariq, there's something real there. She loves her son. She wants better for him. Sure, Noah said, leaning forward. But that doesn't mean she's not hiding something too. People don't just crash weddings and throw around accusations unless they're after something. Emma hesitated, the weight of his words settling over her. You think she has an agenda? I think it's worth finding out, Noah said firmly. And if she's playing games, you deserve to know. Emma swallowed hard, her mind racing. She thought of Sophia's pained expression, the bitterness in her voice when she spoke of Khaled. But she also thought of Tariq, his wide, hopeful eyes, his innocent questions. He didn't deserve to be a pawn in anyone's game. A sudden thought struck her, and she looked at Noah. What if Khaled isn't telling the whole truth? What if there's more to this than just payments and regrets? Noah raised an eyebrow. Like what? I don't know, Emma admitted, her voice trembling. But Sophia said something about Khaled's past catching up to him. What if this isn't just about Tariq? What if it's bigger? Noah leaned back, his gaze sharpening. You think someone's pulling the strings? Emma nodded slowly. It feels like there's a piece missing, something Khaled isn't telling me, or doesn't know himself. Noah stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Then let's find it. What? Emma blinked, startled by his sudden energy. If Khaled won't give you answers, maybe we can find them ourselves, Noah said. You said Sophia gave you documents. Let's start there. Emma hesitated, her mind racing. She had wanted answers, yes, but diving into Khaled's secrets felt like crossing a line she wasn't sure she could uncross. Still, the thought of staying in the dark was unbearable. All right, she said, finally standing. Let's do it. Noah grinned, the kind of grin that reminded her why she had always turned to him when things fell apart. That's the Emma I know. The two of them pored over the documents for hours, the bookstore growing quieter as night fell. The more they read, the more questions arose. Transactions, contracts, names Emma didn't recognize. But one name appeared again and again, Rami El-Sayed. Who's Rami? Emma asked, her brow furrowing. Noah shook his head. No idea. But whoever he is, he's tied to Khaled's business. And Sophia. Emma's stomach churned. You think he's the one pulling the strings? It's possible, Noah said, his voice serious. Or maybe he's just another piece of the puzzle. Either way, he's connected. Emma sat back, her mind racing. The shadows surrounding Khaled's life were growing darker, and with each step she took, she felt herself slipping further into a labyrinth she wasn't sure she could escape. But one thing was clear. She couldn't stop now, not until she knew the truth. The weight of the past hung heavy in the air as Emma sat across from Khaled in the estate's private study. The desk between them felt like a barrier, a physical representation of the growing distance in their marriage. Khaled's face was drawn, his normally sharp eyes dulled by exhaustion and something deeper, regret. You said you wanted the truth, Khaled began, his voice low, steady. It's time I gave it to you. Emma leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly on the desk. Then stop holding back. I can't keep guessing what's real and what's not. Khaled nodded, his gaze dropping to the leather-bound journal in his hands. He opened it, flipping through pages filled with faded notes and sketches, the remnants of a life lived long before Emma ever entered his world. When I was younger, Khaled started, his voice thick, I didn't have the luxury of making mistakes. My father, he was a powerful man, but he didn't tolerate failure. He built an empire from nothing, and he expected the same from me. Emma remained silent, her chest tightening as she caught the flicker of pain in Khaled's expression. He rarely spoke of his family, and now she understood why. "My father's death wasn't an accident," Khaled said, his words dropping like stones into the quiet room. "It was a message, a warning to those who crossed the wrong people in business." Emma's breath caught. "You mean someone killed him?" Khaled nodded grimly. "Rami El-Sayed," he said, the name heavy with venom. "He was one of my father's closest partners, or so we thought. When my father refused to bend to Rami's demands, it cost him his life." Emma's heart raced, the puzzle pieces she'd been gathering snapping into place. "And now Rami is tied to Sophia?" "Yes," Khaled confirmed. "He's using her to get to me, to unravel everything I've built." Emma stood abruptly, the gravity of Khaled's words making her head spin. "So this isn't just about Tariq. This is about revenge, about your father's death." Khaled looked at her, his eyes dark with emotion. "It's about both. Rami's been in the shadows for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, with Sophia and Tariq, he has the perfect leverage." Emma paced the room, her mind reeling. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Why did you let me walk into this blind?" "I thought I could protect you," Khaled said, his voice cracking. "The less you knew, the safer you were." Emma turned to him, her voice rising. "But I'm not safe, Khaled. I'm in this now, whether you like it or not. And the secrets you've kept have only made things worse." Khaled rose from his chair, his hands pressed against the desk as he met her gaze. "You think I don't know that? Every day I wake up wondering if today will be the day Rami takes you from me, or Tariq, or everything I've fought to protect." The raw emotion in his voice stopped Emma in her tracks. For the first time, she saw not the confident, composed man she married, but someone haunted by his past and terrified of losing his future. Her anger softened, replaced by something heavier, an ache she couldn't ignore. "What do we do now?" Emma asked, her voice quieter. "How do we stop him?" Khaled straightened, determination hardening his features. "We fight back. I've spent years gathering evidence against Rami, but it's not enough. Not yet. If we can prove his connection to Sophia and expose his crimes, we can end this." Emma nodded, her resolve strengthening. "Then we do it, together." Khaled hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure? This won't be easy, Emma, and it won't be safe." Emma stepped closer, placing her hand over his. "I'm sure," she said firmly, "but I need you to promise me something." "Anything," Khaled said, his voice soft. "No more secrets," Emma said, her eyes locking onto his. "If we're going to get through this, I need to know everything, no matter how bad it is." Khaled swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "No more secrets," he promised. Emma nodded, the words settling into her heart like a fragile seed of hope. But as she turned to leave, a question lingered in her mind, one she couldn't ignore. "Khaled," she said, pausing at the door, "why did you never tell me about Tariq? Not just Sophia, but him." Khaled's shoulders slumped, the weight of his guilt visible. "Because I was afraid," he admitted, "afraid of what you'd think of me, afraid of losing you." Emma's chest tightened, tears pricking at her eyes. "You almost did," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't let that happen again." She stepped out of the study, the door closing softly behind her. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows surrounding Khaled's past were darker and more dangerous than either of them truly understood. The silence of the estate was deceptive, blanketing the grounds in a calm that belied the storm brewing inside. Emma sat in Khaled's study, the faint glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows against the darkened walls. Her hands rested on the table, trembling slightly as she stared at the collection of documents spread before her. Names, numbers, transactions, all pointing to a web of deceit far more intricate than she could have imagined. Khaled entered the room, his expression tense, and shut the door behind him. "I got your message," he said, his voice low. "What's so urgent?" Emma looked up, her jaw tight. "I found something," she said, sliding a folder toward him. "Or rather, Noah did." Khaled's brow furrowed as he opened the folder. His eyes scanned the papers, his frown deepening with every line. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. Sophia's documents, Emma replied. Noah helped me piece them together. There's a name that keeps coming up. Jack Carmichael. Khaled's hands froze, the color draining from his face. He set the papers down slowly, his expression hardening. Jack is my most trusted advisor, he said, his voice tight. He's been with me since the beginning. Emma leaned forward, her eyes sharp. Then explain this, she said, pointing to a specific page. Sophia's financial records, payments to an account under Jack's name, consistent, large sums. Khaled's breath quickened as he studied the page, his mind racing. No, there's no way, he muttered. Jack would never. Wouldn't he? Emma cut in, her voice trembling with anger. You've trusted him for years. But what if he's been working against you all along? Khaled stood abruptly, pacing the room as his thoughts churned. I need to talk to him, he said, his tone resolute. Right now. No, Emma said sharply, standing as well. If he's been betraying you, you can't let him know you're onto him. Not yet. Khaled stopped, his eyes locking onto hers. Then what do you suggest? Sit back and wait for him to make his next move. We set a trap, Emma said firmly. Let him think he's in control, make him slip. Khaled hesitated, his jaw clenching. He hated the idea of playing games, but Emma's logic was sound. Finally, he nodded. All right, but if Jack has betrayed me, his voice trailed off, the unspoken consequences hanging heavily in the air. The next evening, Khaled invited Jack to the estate under the pretense of a private meeting. Emma stayed hidden in an adjacent room, her heart pounding as she listened to their conversation through a discreet audio device. Khaled, Jack began, his tone familiar, even warm. You sounded tense on the phone. What's going on? Khaled forced a smile, leaning back in his chair. I've been looking into Rami El-Sayed, he said casually. It seems he's been making moves against us. Jack stiffened slightly, though his face remained composed. Rami's always been a snake, he said, his voice carefully neutral. What's he done now? Payments, Khaled said, watching Jack closely. Large sums moving through unexpected accounts. It's almost as if someone on the inside is helping him. Jack's expression didn't falter, but Emma could see the faintest twitch in his jaw through the barely cracked door. That's a serious accusation, Jack said, his tone measured. Do you have proof? Not yet, Khaled admitted, leaning forward. But I will. The tension in the room was palpable, each word a calculated move in a dangerous game. Jack offered a tight smile. If there's anything I can do to help, you know I'm here. I'm counting on that, Khaled said, his voice cool. As Jack stood to leave, Khaled extended his hand, forcing a calm demeanor. Jack shook it, his grip firm but fleeting. When the door closed behind him, Khaled exhaled sharply, his mask slipping. Emma stepped into the room, her expression grim. He's lying, she said. I know, Khaled replied, his voice heavy. Now we just need to prove it. Later that night, Emma couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room, her mind racing with the implications of what they'd uncovered. If Jack had truly betrayed Khaled, it wasn't just a matter of trust, it was a matter of survival. Her phone buzzed, the sound slicing through the quiet. She picked it up, her heart sinking as she read the message. You're digging too deep. Stop before it's too late. Her breath caught, her pulse quickening. She hurried to Khaled's room, finding him seated at his desk, his head in his hands. Khaled, she said, holding up the phone. We're not just dealing with Jack. Someone else is watching us. Khaled looked up, his expression grim but determined. Then we can't stop now, he said. Not until we expose them all. The industrial warehouse on the outskirts of the city loomed ominously under the dim moonlight. Its corrugated metal walls, streaked with rust, stood like silent sentinels guarding the secrets within. Khaled adjusted his cufflinks as he stepped out of the sleek black car, his expression calm but his jaw set with determination. He had always known this moment would come, a confrontation he couldn't avoid. Emma sat in the car, her breath shallow as she watched him walk toward the entrance. Are you sure about this? She whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear her. Her fingers gripped the seat tightly, her heart pounding. She wanted to scream for him to stop, to get back in the car, to leave this entire mess behind, but it was too late for that. Inside, the dim lighting cast long shadows on the concrete floor. Khaled's footsteps echoed as he approached the small circle of men waiting in the center of the space. At their head stood Rami El-Sayed, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering light of a single hanging bulb. His presence radiated power, a sinister confidence that made the air feel heavier. "Khaled," Rami greeted, spreading his arms in mock warmth. "It's been too long." "Not long enough," Khaled replied coolly, his eyes narrowing. "Let's skip the pleasantries." Rami chuckled, motioning for Khaled to step closer. "Always so direct. It's what I've always admired about you." Khaled ignored the bait, his focus unwavering. "You wanted me here. I'm here. What do you want?" Rami's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "It's simple. I want control. Your assets, your empire. It's time you stepped aside and handed it over to someone more capable." Khaled let out a humorless laugh. "You mean you?" "Precisely," Rami said, his tone light but his words heavy with menace. "You can't protect what you've built, Khaled. Not with your family, your wife, and now your son as leverage." Khaled's fists clenched at the mention of Tariq. "Leave my family out of this," he growled. "This is between you and me." "Is it?" Rami mused, his tone dripping with false curiosity. "Your son didn't choose to be born into this mess, but here he is, vulnerable, exposed. The same goes for your lovely wife. Do you really think you can keep them safe while holding on to your precious empire?" Khaled stepped closer, his voice low and lethal. "You don't touch them, ever." Rami's smirk faded slightly, but his confidence remained. "Then make the right choice, Khaled. Walk away, sign over the assets, and I'll ensure they live peacefully, blissfully unaware of the storm they've narrowly avoided." Khaled paused, the weight of the decision crushing him. He knew Rami's words were poison, but there was truth in his threat. He could feel Emma's presence outside, her silent support anchoring him, but also reminding him of what he stood to lose. "What guarantees do I have that you'll keep your word?" Khaled asked, his voice steady but his chest tight. "You don't," Rami said with a wicked grin. "But you don't have much of a choice, do you?" The silence that followed was deafening. Khaled's mind raced, calculating every possible outcome, every risk. Finally he spoke, his words measured but resolute. "You'll get some of it, enough to keep you satisfied, but I retain control of the core assets." Rami raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A compromise?" "Call it insurance," Khaled said. "You get what you want without burning everything to the ground, and in return you leave my family out of it, permanently." Rami tilted his head, considering the offer. After a tense pause, he nodded. "Fine. But if I sense even the slightest betrayal, Khaled, you'll wish you had taken my first offer." The tension in Khaled's shoulders eased slightly, but his instincts remained sharp. He extended his hand, and Rami took it with a firm grip. The deal was struck, but the unease lingered, a dark cloud over what should have been a resolution. As Khaled exited the warehouse, his steps purposeful but heavy, he saw Emma waiting for him by the car. Her eyes searched his face, desperate for reassurance. "Well?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's done," Khaled said quietly, "but it's far from over." Emma's heart sank at the gravity in his tone. She wanted to believe they were closer to safety, but deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of a battle they couldn't yet see. The explosion ripped through the air with a deafening roar, shaking the ground beneath Emma's feet. She stumbled back, her scream drowned out by the sound of splintering metal and shattering glass. The warehouse, once an ominous but stable structure, was now engulfed in flames and smoke that rose violently into the night sky. "Khaled!" Emma's voice was hoarse as she ran toward the fiery chaos, her vision blurred by tears. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst, fear gripping her chest like a vice. She could barely see through the thick smoke, her lungs burning with every desperate breath. "Khaled!" Amidst the wreckage, figures emerged, men in suits, some staggering, others running, their faces pale with shock. None of them were Khaled. Emma's panic surged as she scanned the crowd, her mind racing through every terrible possibility. She pushed past the dazed bodies, ignoring the sting of debris scraping her skin. "Mrs. Al-Nasseri!" a voice called out, cutting through the chaos. Emma turned sharply to see Khaled's driver, his face streaked with soot, running toward her. "He's inside!" Emma's heart stopped. "What do you mean inside? He was supposed to be out." "He went back!" the driver shouted, his voice trembling. He said something about documents. He didn't want to leave without them. No, Emma whispered, her knees nearly buckling under the weight of the words. She didn't wait for further explanation. Her body moved on instinct, rushing toward the crumbling building. Wait! You can't! The driver's protests were drowned out by the crackling of the flames and the chaos around them. Emma didn't care. She couldn't lose him. Not like this. The heat was unbearable as she reached the entrance, her hands trembling as she pushed against the splintered door. Inside, the smoke was suffocating, the air thick with ash and the acrid stench of burning chemicals. She covered her mouth with her sleeve, her eyes darting frantically in search of Khaled. Khaled! She screamed, her voice breaking. Where are you? A faint cough reached her ears, followed by a groan. She whipped her head around, her eyes locking onto a shadow slumped against a pile of debris. It was him. Khaled! Emma scrambled over the wreckage, her hands shaking as she reached him. He was covered in soot, his face pale and bloodied, but his eyes opened weakly as she knelt beside him. Emma, his voice was barely audible, his hand reaching out to touch her face. You shouldn't be here. Don't you dare say that, she snapped, her voice choked with emotion. We're getting out of here, now. Khaled tried to sit up, wincing as pain racked his body. The documents, I couldn't leave them. I don't care about the damn documents, Emma cried, tears streaming down her face. I care about you. We have to move, Khaled, please. He nodded weakly, his breath labored. Emma wrapped her arms around him, summoning every ounce of strength she had to lift him to his feet. Together, they stumbled toward the exit, the flames licking at their heels. The building groaned ominously, its structure threatening to collapse at any moment. Just as they reached the door, a beam crashed down in front of them, blocking their path. Emma screamed, pulling Khaled back as the fire roared louder, the heat searing her skin. This way! A voice shouted from the side. The driver appeared through the smoke, his arms outstretched as he cleared a path for them. Hurry! Emma tightened her grip on Khaled, dragging him toward the opening. Her muscles burned, her lungs felt like they might give out, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Finally, they burst through the door, collapsing onto the ground outside as fresh air hit their faces. Emma gasped for breath, her chest heaving as she cradled Khaled's head in her lap. His eyes fluttered open, his gaze meeting hers. You're insane, he murmured, a faint smile tugging at his lips. And you're an idiot, Emma shot back, her voice breaking with relief. But you're alive! Tears streamed down her face as sirens wailed in the distance. The fire illuminated the night sky, casting an eerie glow over the scene. But Emma didn't care. She held on to Khaled, her heart pounding against his chest, silently vowing that she would never let him face anything alone again. The hospital room was quiet, the sterile white walls doing little to ease Emma's frayed nerves. She sat beside Khaled's bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He lay motionless, his face pale against the crisp pillow, the oxygen mask over his nose and mouth obscuring his features. Despite his stillness, his chest rose and fell with a steady rhythm, a fragile sign of life that Emma clung to desperately. The doctor had assured her that Khaled's injuries weren't fatal, but the smoke inhalation and the gash on his side from falling debris meant he needed rest. Emma had barely slept since they'd been rushed here the night before. The memory of the fire and the moments she thought she might lose him replayed in her mind like a nightmare on loop. A knock on the door broke her thoughts. She turned to see Noah stepping inside, a laptop tucked under his arm. His usual easygoing demeanor was replaced with an urgency that Emma recognized immediately. I have something, Noah said, closing the door behind him. But you're not going to like it. Emma's stomach churned as she stood and gestured for him to sit. What is it? She asked, her voice low but firm. Noah placed the laptop on the small table and opened it, revealing a series of encrypted emails. I did some digging into Rami and Jack's connections, and, well, it's worse than we thought. Emma leaned over the screen, her pulse quickening as she read the messages. They detailed a timeline of Rami's dealings with Jack, dating back years. Payments, false contracts, and even direct orders to sabotage Khaled's projects, all documented in damning detail. Noah, this... Emma's voice trembled as she looked at him. This is enough to destroy them. It's a start, Noah replied grimly. But there's more. These messages, some of them were forwarded to Sophia. Emma froze. Sophia? Noah nodded. She's been playing both sides, helping Rami while feeding Khaled just enough information to keep him on edge. It's all a game to her. Emma's chest tightened, a mix of anger and betrayal boiling within her. And Tariq? Was he part of her plan too? Noah hesitated, his expression softening. I don't think so. Everything I found suggests she genuinely cares about him, but that doesn't excuse what she's done. Emma paced the room, her thoughts a whirlwind. This has to end. We have to stop them. We can, Noah said, his tone cautious. But we'll need Khaled to do it. He's the only one who can expose Rami without it blowing back on us. Emma glanced at Khaled, her heart aching at the sight of him so vulnerable. He's not ready, she said quietly. Not yet. Then we wait, Noah replied. But not too long. They're going to realize we're onto them. As if on cue, Khaled stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. Emma rushed to his side, her hand reaching for his. Khaled, she whispered, her voice thick with relief. You're awake. He blinked, his gaze unfocused at first, but it quickly sharpened as he took in the room. Emma, he croaked, his voice raspy. What happened? You're safe, she said, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. You were in the fire, but you're okay now. Khaled nodded weakly, his hand tightening around hers. The documents. Emma hesitated, then nodded. We got them. They're safe. Khaled closed his eyes, a flicker of relief crossing his face. Good. There's more, Emma said softly. Noah found evidence, enough to take Rami and Jack down. Khaled's eyes snapped open, the exhaustion in them replaced with determination. Show me. Noah stepped forward, turning the laptop so Khaled could see the screen. He explained everything, each revelation deepening the lines of anger and resolve on Khaled's face. When Noah finished, Khaled's voice was quiet but firm. We need to act, now. Khaled, you're not ready, Emma protested. You need rest. I don't have time for rest, Khaled said, his voice stronger. Rami won't stop until he's destroyed everything I've built, everything we've built. Emma searched his eyes, seeing the fire in them, the same fire that had drawn her to him in the first place. She nodded, her resolve matching his. Then let's end this. Khaled turned to Noah. We'll need a plan, something they won't see coming. Noah smirked. I thought you'd say that. Don't worry, I've got a few ideas. As the three of them began to strategize, Emma felt a shift. This wasn't just about revenge or survival anymore. This was their turning point. A chance to take back control and finally shatter the shadows that had loomed over their lives. The quiet of the estate library was punctuated only by the sound of Emma's hurried footsteps on the polished floor. The folder in her hands felt heavier than it should, its contents holding answers she both dreaded and needed. Khaled stood by the large oak desk, his posture rigid, his eyes locked onto the faint glow of a tablet screen. He looked up as she entered, his expression a mix of anticipation and exhaustion. You found something, he asked, his voice steady despite the tension that laced it. Emma nodded, her breath shallow as she placed the folder on the desk between them. Noah did, she said. It's about your father. Khaled's face darkened. He slowly opened the folder, pulling out a series of faded documents, letters, and photographs. His eyes scanned the pages, his hand trembling slightly as he pieced together the story that had eluded him for so long. These letters, Emma said, pointing to one in particular. They were written to your father months before his death, from Rami. Khaled picked up the letter, his eyes narrowing as he read the threatening words scrawled in sharp, angry handwriting. This is your final warning. Join us, or face the consequences. His jaw tightened, his breathing shallow as he set the letter down. He knew, Khaled murmured, his voice heavy with realization. My father knew Rami was coming for him. Emma stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm gently. There's more, she said softly. Rami wasn't working alone. Your father's records mention a silent partner, someone who was pulling strings from the shadows. Khaled's gaze snapped to hers, his eyes blazing. Who? Emma hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack. The name hung in the air like a curse, the weight of it suffocating. Khaled turned away, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as he processed the betrayal. "All this time," he muttered, "he was right there, smiling in my face, advising me, and all along he was working with Rami." Emma's chest tightened at the pain in his voice. "We can use this," she said, her tone firm. "This is the missing piece we needed. Proof that Jack and Rami have been conspiring for years." Khaled turned back to her, his expression a mix of anger and determination. "This isn't just about business," he said. "This is personal. Jack didn't just betray me, he betrayed my family, my father." Emma nodded, her resolve matching his. "Then we take it to the authorities. We expose them." "No," Khaled said sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Not yet. If we go public now, they'll destroy the evidence before we can pin them down. We need to trap them first." Emma frowned, her brow furrowing. "How?" Khaled's lips curved into a grim smile. "We make them think they've won. We'll give them what they want, on our terms." Emma's heart pounded at the implications of his plan, but she knew he was right. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. For Khaled's father, for Tariq, for everything Rami and Jack had taken from them. "I'm with you," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Khaled's eyes softened as he looked at her, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "I don't deserve you," he murmured. Emma's breath hitched at the raw emotion in his voice. "We don't have time for that," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You and I, we're in this together, no matter what." Khaled nodded, the fire in his eyes reigniting. He turned back to the desk, his hands moving with precision as he gathered the documents. "We'll meet with Noah tonight," he said. "We'll finalize the plan." Emma nodded, her determination unwavering. But as she stepped toward the door, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her stomach sinking as she read the message. "Time's up. You've been warned." Her blood ran cold as she turned to Khaled. "They know," she said, her voice shaking. "They're on to us." Khaled's jaw tightened, his mind racing. "Then we don't wait," he said. "We end this. Now." Emma swallowed hard, her fear tempered by resolve. The stakes had never been higher, but she knew they couldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The grand conference hall buzzed with tension, the air electric with anticipation. Rows of journalists, industry insiders, and spectators packed the space, their murmurs bouncing off the marble walls. Cameras lined the back of the room, their lenses trained on the empty podium under the glaring lights. The weight of what was about to unfold hung heavy, palpable. Emma stood in the wings, her fingers gripping the edge of the curtain as she peeked out at the crowd. Her heart raced, but her resolve remained unshaken. This was it, the moment they had been building toward. She turned to Khaled, who was adjusting his tie with steady hands. His expression was calm, unreadable, but she could see the fire burning behind his eyes. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice low. Khaled glanced at her, his lips curving into a faint smile. "I was born ready," he said, but then his gaze softened. "Thank you for standing by me through this." Emma swallowed the lump in her throat, her chest tightening. "We're not done yet," she replied. "Go, show them who you are." Khaled nodded, straightening his shoulders as he stepped onto the stage. The murmurs in the audience hushed instantly, replaced by the click of camera shutters and the hum of live streams firing up. Khaled approached the podium, his commanding presence filling the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, carrying to the farthest corners of the hall. "Thank you for being here today. What I'm about to share will change everything you thought you knew, not just about my business, but about those who operate in its shadows." The crowd leaned in, captivated. Khaled's words were measured, deliberate, as he outlined the intricate web of deceit orchestrated by Rami El-Sayed and Jack Carmichael. He presented damning evidence, emails, financial records, and sworn testimonies that laid bare the conspiracy that had spanned years. Gasps rippled through the audience as Khaled detailed Rami's involvement in his father's murder, the manipulation of Sophia, and the systematic attempts to dismantle his empire. He paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd, before delivering the final blow. "And now, I have one last piece of evidence," Khaled said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He held up a flash drive, its metallic surface glinting under the lights. This contains recordings of conversations between Rami and Jack, proving their collusion beyond any doubt. Today, I am making this information public." The room erupted in chaos, flashes from cameras, shouted questions from reporters, and murmurs of shock from the spectators. Khaled stood firm, his presence unyielding, as he plugged the drive into the screen behind him. The damning recordings filled the hall, each word a nail in the coffin of the men who had sought to destroy him. Emma watched from the wings, her chest swelling with pride. Khaled was no longer just defending himself. He was taking back control, reclaiming the narrative that others had tried to twist. She wiped away a tear as she saw the weight visibly lift from his shoulders. As the recordings ended, Khaled stepped back to the podium. His voice was calm, resolute. "For too long, the actions of a few have cast shadows over the lives of many. Today, those shadows end. Justice will be served." The audience erupted into applause, the noise deafening. Khaled stepped away from the podium, his head held high as he walked off stage. Emma rushed to meet him, her arms wrapping around him tightly. "You did it," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You actually did it." "We did it," Khaled corrected, his voice soft but firm. "I couldn't have done this without you." Their moment of triumph was interrupted as Noah approached, his expression serious. "Jack and Rami have been arrested," he said. "The authorities are moving fast. It's over." Khaled nodded, his relief tempered by exhaustion. "Good. Let them face the consequences of their actions." As they stepped out of the hall together, the warm glow of the afternoon sun greeted them. Reporters clamored for statements, but Khaled simply held Emma's hand tighter, his gaze focused on the horizon. For the first time in years, the shadows had lifted, but Khaled knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where he could finally live without fear, with Emma by his side. The soft glow of the morning sun bathed the estate in warmth, casting long shadows across the manicured gardens. Emma stood on the balcony of their bedroom, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea as she watched the world come alive. The events of the past weeks felt like a lifetime ago, the chaos replaced by a tentative sense of peace. Behind her, Khaled stirred, his voice rough with sleep. "You've been up for a while," he said, stepping onto the balcony beside her. He placed a hand on the small of her back, his touch grounding her. "I couldn't sleep," Emma admitted, her voice soft. "Too much on my mind." Khaled nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I know the feeling." They stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken words between them hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Emma turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "What happens now, Khaled? To us? To Tariq?" Khaled sighed, his expression pained but determined. "I've reached out to Sophia," he said. "She's agreed to let me be part of Tariq's life, if I'm serious about it." Emma's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. "And are you?" "I have to be," Khaled said firmly. "For him, for me. I've spent too long running from my responsibilities, Emma. It's time I made things right." Emma placed a hand on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "And us? Can we make things right too?" Khaled's eyes softened as he cupped her face in his hands. "I've made mistakes," he said, his voice trembling. "So many mistakes. But if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you." Tears welled in Emma's eyes as she nodded. "I want to move forward, Khaled, but I need to know that I can trust you completely." "You can," Khaled said, his voice steady. "No more secrets, no more lies." Their moment was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up the driveway. Emma and Khaled exchanged a glance before heading downstairs. At the door stood Sophia, holding Tariq's hand. The boy's dark eyes lit up when he saw Khaled, his grip tightening on his mother's fingers. "Hello, Tariq," Khaled said, his voice soft as he crouched to the boy's level. "It's good to see you again." Tariq hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, his small hand reaching for Khaled's. "Are you really my dad?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Khaled's breath caught, his throat tightening. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am, and I'm sorry it took me so long to say it." Tariq stared at him for a moment before throwing his arms around Khaled's neck. Khaled held him tightly, his eyes closing as tears streamed down his face. Emma felt her own tears fall as she watched the scene, her heart full. Sophia cleared her throat, her voice breaking the silence. "This is what he's wanted for so long," she said, her tone soft but firm. "Don't let him down." "I won't," Khaled promised, his voice resolute. Later that day, the four of them sat together in the garden, sharing stories and laughter. It wasn't perfect, there was still so much to navigate, but it was a start, a new beginning. As the sun set, Emma and Khaled stood at the edge of the garden, watching Tariq chase fireflies under Sophia's watchful eye. Khaled wrapped his arms around Emma, pulling her close. "This is all I've ever wanted," he murmured, "a chance to start over, to build something real." Emma leaned into him, her heart swelling with hope. "We'll build it together," she said, "one step at a time." For the first time in what felt like forever, Khaled felt at peace. He wasn't just redeeming himself, he was building a future worth fighting for, with Emma by his side and Tariq in his life. And for the first time, the shadows of his past no longer felt like chains holding him back. They were stepping into the light, together. The first rays of dawn crept over the rolling hills of the estate, casting a golden glow on the dew-kissed grass. Emma stood at the edge of the terrace, her arms wrapped around herself as she watched the sunrise. The world felt still, quiet, as if holding its breath for what was to come. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of calm, a fragile yet precious peace. Behind her, the sound of small, hurried footsteps broke the silence. She turned to see Tariq bounding toward her, his dark eyes wide with excitement. "Emma!" he called, his voice bright. "Khaled said I could ride the horses today. Can you come too?" Emma smiled, her heart swelling at the boy's joy. "Of course," she said, kneeling to his level, "but only if you promise to show me how brave you are on the saddle." Tariq grinned, nodding enthusiastically. "I'll show you," he said before darting back toward the stables, his laughter trailing behind him. Emma rose, her gaze following Tariq as he disappeared around the corner. She felt Khaled's presence before she saw him, the warmth of his hand on her shoulder grounding her. "He adores you," Khaled said softly, his voice carrying a quiet reverence. Emma turned to him, her smile tinged with emotion. "And he's finally starting to adore you too," she said. "You're good with him, Khaled. Better than you give yourself credit for." Khaled's expression softened, his hand slipping into hers. "I'm trying," he said, "for him, for us." "And you're doing more than trying," Emma replied, squeezing his hand. "You're becoming the father he needs." They stood together in the morning light, their hands entwined, as the distant sound of hooves echoed from the stables. The chaos of the past months felt like a distant memory, the scars it left now serving as reminders of their resilience. Khaled turned to Emma, his eyes searching hers. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice hesitant, "about what's next for us." Emma raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Khaled exhaled, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "For so long, my life has been about survival, about building walls to keep the world out. But I don't want that anymore. I want something real, something lasting." Emma's heart quickened at the sincerity in his tone. "And what does that look like?" she asked. "It looks like this," Khaled said, gesturing around them. "A life where Tariq feels safe, where we can wake up every morning and know that the shadows are behind us, where we build something together, not out of necessity, but out of love." Tears pricked Emma's eyes as she nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "I want that too," she said. "But it's going to take time, Khaled. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight." "I know," Khaled said, his tone earnest, "and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Their moment was interrupted as Tariq's voice called out from the stables. "Emma, Khaled, come on." Emma laughed, the sound light and free, as she took Khaled's hand. "We'd better go before he decides to start without us," she said. Khaled smiled, his grip on her hand firm. "Let's go." As they walked toward the stables, the sun continued to rise, casting the estate in vibrant hues of orange and gold. For the first time in a long time, Khaled felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: hope. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wouldn't face it alone. Together they would carve out a new beginning, one built on trust, redemption, and love. And as the new day unfolded, so did the promise of a brighter future.